A racist officer chokes a black veteran, completely unaware he's the chief of security for the president. The city pulsed with uneasy energy, the kind that settled deep into the bones of those who lived within its streets. Rain slicked the pavement, turning the cracked roads into reflective pools of dim yellow light. The street lamps buzzed faintly, their glow flickering against the wet asphalt, casting distorted reflections of broken-down buildings and shattered storefront windows. The air was thick, not just with the humidity of an earlier storm, but with the tension that never seemed to leave this part of town. It was the kind of place where time moved slower, where desperation clung to people like a second skin. Here, the law wasn't a beacon of safety. It was a looming shadow, a presence that hovered over street corners and alleyways, a silent enforcer of fear rather than protection. People had learned to keep their heads down, to move with caution, to disappear into the background when red and blue lights slashed through the darkness. Jamal Briggs didn't belong here. He had no business standing on this stretch of cracked sidewalk, no reason to be near these run-down buildings with their boarded-up windows and rusted-out cars lining the curb. He was a man who spent his days in places of power, where his presence commanded attention, where people straightened their backs when he entered a room. And yet, here he was. He exhaled slowly, frustration curling at the edges of his breath as he stared down at the hood of his car. The sleek black vehicle, always so reliable, had sputtered and died in the worst possible place at the worst possible time. He had been driving back from a classified meeting, his mind still running through security assessments, contingency plans, high-level risk protocols, plans that shaped the safety of the most powerful person in the world. But none of that mattered here. The engine wouldn't turn. The lights flickered before shutting off completely, leaving the street even darker than before. He debated calling one of his security teams. They were always on standby, just a call away, ready to respond within minutes. But the thought of sitting in a dead car, waiting for men in dark suits and black SUVs to show up flashing government IDs, felt unnecessary. He had dealt with worse. The streets of Baghdad, the heat of Kandahar. Nights spent listening for the distant echo of gunfire in places where danger was more certain than sunrise. A broken-down car? That was nothing. Jamal adjusted the cuffs of his suit, his movements calm, deliberate. He stepped out, locking the vehicle behind him as an automatic reflex. The moment his feet touched the pavement, his senses sharpened, an old habit that never faded no matter how far he was from a battlefield. He scanned his surroundings, his eyes flicking across the buildings, the doorways, the alleys between them. The neighborhood wasn't entirely abandoned. A few figures lingered on front porches, half hidden behind rusted-out railings. A cigarette ember flared in the darkness, the faint glow briefly illuminating a pair of watching eyes before vanishing again. A car idled further down the street, headlights off, the silhouette of the driver barely visible through the rain-speckled windshield. Jamal wasn't afraid, but he knew how this looked. A tall, broad-shouldered black man in a fitted suit, walking through a part of town where men like him were either feared or ignored. Where the wrong kind of attention could mean the difference between walking away and becoming another cautionary tale. The air felt heavier now, thick with the weight of unspoken expectations. He moved with purpose, heading toward the gas station a block ahead. He told himself it would be fine. He would buy a can of fuel, walk back, get his car started, and be gone before anyone cared to notice him. But the city had other plans. The red and blue lights came first, slicing through the dark like knives. The sound of tires crunching against loose gravel followed, slow and deliberate. Then, the low hum of an engine idling, the unmistakable crackle of a police radio somewhere inside the car. Jamal sighed. This again. The cruiser inched forward before coming to a full stop just a few feet away. The spotlight snapped on, bathing him in harsh white light. His suit, still damp from the misty rain, gleamed under the intensity, making him squint. He didn't turn away. The moment stretched, the world shrinking to just him and the unseen officer sitting in the car, watching, assessing. Jamal had lived this scene before, too many times. He knew the drill. He knew the way things could turn with the wrong word, the wrong movement, the wrong kind of defiance in his posture. He had been trained in threat assessments, in reading body language, in anticipating danger before it unfolded. And yet, none of that training mattered when the person in power saw him as a threat before he had even opened his mouth. The driver's side door creaked open, slow and methodical. A figure emerged, stepping into the beam of the spotlight. The uniform was crisp, the badge gleaming under the artificial light. But it wasn't the uniform that mattered. It was the eyes, cold, calculating, suspicious. Jamal already knew how this would go. He had seen it play out too many times. He exhaled, steadying himself, keeping his hands at his sides, fingers relaxed, palms open. He had spent years ensuring the safety of the most powerful man in the world. And yet, in this moment, standing on this cracked sidewalk under the scrutiny of an officer who had already decided he didn't belong, Jamal Briggs was just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. The officer stepped forward. His hand was already resting on his weapon. Jamal barely had time to turn before the police cruiser's door swung open with force, the creaking hinges barely audible over the patter of light rain against the pavement. The officer stepped out, his boots landing with deliberate weight, the sound sharp against the quiet night. He moved with the slow, confident stride of a man who believed himself untouchable. Jamal took in his size immediately. Tall, broad, a thick build that suggested hours spent in the gym, sculpting a body designed to dominate. His uniform fit snugly over his frame, the black leather belt around his waist loaded with everything a man needed to exert control. A gun, a baton, handcuffs, a radio clipped near his shoulder. The golden badge pinned to his chest caught the dim glow of the streetlight. But it wasn't the badge that held Jamal's attention. It was the eyes. There was no caution in them, no genuine curiosity, no attempt to assess the situation beyond what he had already decided in his head. Just suspicion. Jamal had seen that look before, on patrol overseas, in high-security briefings, in the faces of men who assumed danger before they understood it. It was the look of someone who had already made up his mind. He had been marked as a problem before he had even spoken a word. The officer's hand hovered near his holster, his fingers twitching slightly over the grip of his sidearm. Not a full reach, just enough to send a message. The kind of subtle movement meant to remind someone who was in charge. Jamal remained still. He knew better than to move too quickly, better than to reach into his pocket for identification without being explicitly told. Every instinct honed through years of military training told him that a single wrong move could shift this encounter from tense to deadly. The officer asked what he was doing here. His voice was sharp, clipped, the kind of tone meant to assert control rather than seek answers. Jamal met his gaze evenly, keeping his own voice steady. He explained that his car had broken down, that he was heading to the gas station just ahead. Simple, director. The officer didn't react right away. His gaze flicked toward the dark shape of Jamal's car in the distance, then back to him. A slow, deliberate assessment, as if searching for a reason not to believe him. Disbelief settled into his features. It hardened into something uglier. Jamal had seen this before, too. The doubt, the assumption that he was lying, that a man like him, black, well-dressed, confident, did not belong in a neighborhood like this unless he was up to something. He could almost hear the thoughts forming behind the officer's stern expression. Too well-dressed to be local, too calm to be innocent, too black to be trusted. Jamal watched as the officer's jaw clenched. A choice was being made in real time, not based on logic, not on actual suspicion, just on instinct. An instinct that had been trained into too many men like him. The officer ordered him to put his hands against the car. Jamal didn't move. He had spent years training government operatives on threat assessments, briefing high-level officials on security protocols, advising the most powerful leaders in the world on how to de-escalate volatile situations. He had done nothing wrong. And yet, none of that mattered now. The rain drizzled steadily around them, making the street glisten under the yellowed glow of the flickering lampposts. The city seemed to shrink away, the background noise fading into irrelevance. Jamal had a decision to make. He could comply, let this man throw him against the car, feel the rough hands of authority press him down like he was less than human. Or he could resist, speak up, demand an explanation, refuse to let himself be treated like a suspect. Neither choice would end well for him. The officer reached for his radio, lifting it to his mouth as he muttered something barely audible over the static. Jamal caught enough to understand. Possible suspect. Uncooperative. The first label had been assigned. Jamal exhaled, slow and controlled, forcing down the rising frustration pressing against his ribs. He was not a soldier in combat. He was not under threat from an enemy force. But his body didn't seem to know the difference. Before he could say another word, the officer moved. A rough grip seized Jamal's wrist, twisting it behind his back with practiced ease. The motion was sudden, aggressive, not just a restraint, but a warning. Pain flared up Jamal's shoulder as his arm was bent at an unnatural angle. His body tensed, every muscle reacting to the force, but he did not fight back. He had been trained for this, conditioned to endure worse. He tried to speak, tried to tell the officer that he was making a mistake. The officer didn't care. He was already pushing Jamal toward the police car, his grip tightening, his knee pressing against the back of Jamal's leg to force him off balance. The movements were not just about control, they were about dominance. Jamal could hear his heartbeat in his ears, a steady, powerful thrum. Not fear, not yet, but anger. The kind of anger that came from knowing this was not a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. The officer had made his decision the moment he had stepped out of the cruiser. This wasn't about law or safety. It was about reminding Jamal that in this moment, his power meant nothing. His position, his title, his years of service, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the assumption that he was a problem. And problems needed to be controlled. The grip on his wrist tightened further, pain radiating up his arm. He could feel the rough fabric of the officer's uniform pressing against his back, could hear the faint static of the radio still clipped to the man's shoulder. Jamal remained silent, his mind calculating, assessing. This was not the first time a man with a badge had tested his patience, but it might be the first time one regretted it. Jamal's body slammed against the cold metal of the police car with a force that rattled through his ribs. The impact drove the air from his lungs in a sharp, painful burst, but he made no sound. Years of training had conditioned him to absorb pain without reaction, to keep his composure no matter the circumstances. He could feel the rough texture of the metal door beneath his cheek, the vibrations from the idling engine humming through his skin. The officer leaned into him, his weight pressing down with deliberate force, one hand shoving his head forward, the other still locked around his twisted wrist. The position was meant to immobilize, to humiliate. It was the kind of hold designed not just to subdue, but to break a person's will. But it wasn't enough. The officer's knee drove into the back of Jamal's thigh, pinning him against the car, cutting off any chance of movement. He could feel the tension in the man's body, the coiled aggression that had nothing to do with enforcing the law and everything to do with power. Jamal knew what was coming before it happened. The grip shifted. The officer's hand moved from his wrist to his throat. The chokehold came fast, brutal, the pressure sudden and unrelenting. Jamal's body went rigid as his air supply was cut off. The officer's grip was strong, too strong. His fingers dug into Jamal's windpipe with practiced cruelty, crushing down with a force that sent sharp waves of panic through his nervous system. His vision blurred, the dim glow of streetlights stretching into streaks of golden haze. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, each one weaker than the last. His lungs screamed for air, but the pressure did not ease. Adrenaline flooded his body, instincts screaming at him to react. Every fiber of his being demanded that he fight back, that he twist free, strike, disable. His body remembered combat, remembered the precise movements needed to escape, to neutralize a threat. But this was not a battlefield. He could not fight back. Not here. Not now. His fingers curled into fists, his nails digging into his own palms as he forced himself to remain still. His military training had prepared him for pain, for torture, for worst-case scenarios in enemy territory. But nothing had prepared him for this, for the knowledge that, despite everything he had accomplished, despite his rank, his experience, his authority, he was still seen as nothing more than a problem to be subdued. His ears rang, the world narrowing to the suffocating grip around his throat and the slow, creeping weight of oxygen deprivation. His chest ached with the effort of trying to breathe, his pulse pounding violently in his skull. The officer's grip tightened. Jamal's vision darkened at the edges. Then, movement. A sudden shift in the air. A voice. Not the officers. The distant sound of tires grinding against wet pavement. The sharp click of a car door opening. Then, footsteps. A second patrol car had arrived. Jamal could not see, could not turn his head, but he felt the moment the officer's grip hesitated, the fraction of a second where he realized they were no longer alone. Another officer stepped out, his boots hitting the ground with a hesitance that did not match the aggression of his colleague. He was younger, less certain. His voice was tense, laced with confusion as he took in the scene before him. Jamal did not need to see his expression to know the exact moment he recognized him. Recognition dawned not just in his voice, but in the stunned silence that followed. The officer's breath hitched, his stance shifting. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out at first. Jamal could almost feel the rapid-fire thoughts running through his head, the calculations, the slow realization that the man pinned against the police car, struggling for breath, was not just any civilian. He was the chief of security for the President of the United States. And he was one breath away from death. The grip around Jamal's throat loosened suddenly, and his body reacted before his mind caught up. Air rushed back into his lungs, burning its way down his throat as he coughed violently, his chest heaving with the desperate need to breathe. His knees nearly buckled, the weight of exhaustion and oxygen deprivation threatening to pull him down, but he refused to fall. The officer stepped back, his movements slow, his breathing steady. His expression remained unreadable, blank beneath the cold glow of the streetlights. No remorse, no fear. Just the same look of authority, the same rigid posture of a man who had spent years believing he would never be questioned. Jamal inhaled deeply, his throat raw, his pulse still pounding in his ears. The air felt sharp, like knives slicing through his lungs, but he welcomed the pain. It meant he was still alive. The younger officer moved first. His steps were quick, purposeful, his body language betraying his panic. He raised his hand slightly, not in defense but in urgency, as if trying to undo what had just happened. His voice came fast, strained, the weight of recognition heavy in his tone. He addressed Jamal by name, not suspect, not man on the street, but by his full title. Silence fell between them. The air, once thick with unspoken threats, now crackled with something else. Realization. Jamal straightened slowly, his muscles stiff, the imprint of the officer's grip still lingering like a phantom around his throat. His breath remained uneven, but his posture was steady. He turned his head, his gaze locking onto the man who had nearly ended his life. For the first time that night, the officer looked uncertain. The power that had been so absolute just moments ago had begun to slip. Though he didn't move, didn't reach for his radio, didn't speak. His fingers twitched slightly at his sides, the smallest betrayal of nerves. Jamal held his gaze, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of the moment settle in. The officer had made a mistake, and it was one that would cost him everything. Within the hour, the situation had escalated beyond the cracked streets and flickering streetlights of that forgotten neighborhood. Calls were made, names were spoken, and the weight of authority shifted. This wasn't just a bad stop. This wasn't just another overreach of power. The man thrown against the car, the man nearly choked out in the street, was not an anonymous face lost in the system. He was not a man whose complaints could be ignored, whose bruises could be brushed aside, whose life could be reduced to a footnote in an incident report. He was Jamal Briggs, Chief of Security for the President of the United States. By the time the night was over, high-ranking officials had been pulled into the situation. Phone lines buzzed with urgent discussions, damage control strategies, and rapid-fire decisions. The officer who had wrapped his hands around Jamal's throat as if he were squeezing the life out of a pest was stripped of his badge before sunrise. There was no trial, no drawn-out internal review. This was too public, too big to bury. By morning, the headlines were everywhere. Officer fired after assaulting Chief of Security for the President veteran nearly suffocated by cop in routine stop gone wrong. Jamal had endured worse than this. He had been shot at in war zones. He had fought for breath under enemy fire, had felt the weight of bodies pressing against him in combat, had tasted the bitter fear of near-death experiences more times than he could count. But this was different. This had not been an act of war. This had been casual, deliberate, routine. As he stood outside the police station, watching the former officer being escorted away, Jamal felt nothing. No triumph, no sense of victory, just exhaustion. He watched the man walk, his head held high despite his circumstances, his shoulders squared as if he still believed in his own untouchability. Even now, stripped of his badge, the officer moved with the arrogance of someone who had been protected for too long. Jamal clenched his jaw. How many others had not been recognized? How many others had not been saved by rank and status? A powerful title had spared his life. But what about the ones who had no title at all?